Space XPLR episode. Today we have a very special guest from Australia, all the way from there. We have a crazy time difference while we're talking here right now. And today's guest, her name is Tran. So V is a medical student and aspiring space doctor from Australia. She's in 2020, she received the first class for her honors thesis about using artificial gravity to maintain the hip muscles in space. Very important topic. So she's an alumnus of the International Space University Southern Hemisphere Space Studies Program, a big name. In her spare time, V is environmental advocate, long distance runner, and STEM tutor. Her favorite space movies is 2001, a classic, A Space Odyssey. If you've never seen it, go and watch that. So again, you have to make sure that you follow her and get in contact with her. And I think we did through Twitter. So her Twitter handle is Astronaut, which of course is going to be included in the show notes. And maybe we can dug up something else, and we're going to include a bunch of links there so we can you can make a connection with V as well. So we again, thanks for being on the show today. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the time.
Thanks a lot, Martinez. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to know. So listen, because we talked about kind of off camera and we said, okay, we're going to be talking about the space medicine again, keeping astronauts strong in space, which again, we're talking about zero Gs and the subject that always comes up when I have, people like yourself on the podcast, if they work with the projects related to, again, some space medicine or, things like that, creating, let's say, a moon base. One of the conversations is always going to be about decreasing bone density and muscle, and how is that going to have long-term effects on human body. So but first of all, can we talk about your personal experience? And I mean, how did you get involved in this field, and give us a little bit of a background and a story of yours?
Yeah, so my story goes back to when I was 5, and I went outside and looked at the stars, and I went with my father to go to an observatory. And they were showing us the moon through a big, big telescope, probably about a 16-inch Dobsoni or something crazy like that. And when I saw the objects in the sky up close, I was immediately fascinated, and I wanted to research those things because I have this fascination with what we can't see and what we can't touch and feel, but things that exist out there. And I think it's just a big wide world of unknown, and it's a place that I want to be. So I wanted to be an astronomer for most of my schooling life, but then I started to think, well, what if I could do a profession that could help people more one-on-one, because I also had this desire to make an impact in the world. And people will say, if you're an astronomer, you don't have quite a direct impact on human experiences as much as you would in any other profession. So that's when I decided I'd try doing medicine, and I'm still doing that. So I've just done 5 years of medicine and 1 year of honors in health sciences. To do that health science honors, I had to pick a topic that had something to do with health or medical sciences. And I was really fortunate to be able to connect with some people who are working in Germany. And in Germany, there's a place called the German Aerospace Center, which is basically the German NASA. And under that, they have a study which was actually completed last year, for which I did the data analysis this year. That study was called AgBreezer. So it's artificial gravity bed rest at ESA. And so through my connections with these supervisors and my advisors, I was able to analyze the data that came out of that study. Would you like to know a bit about the study?
Of course, that's why we have you today on the show.
Sure. Well, so the general gist of it is that we had 24 healthy participants lie in bed for 60 days. They weren't allowed to get up at all or be vertical at all. They had to have at least one shoulder on the bed at all times. So they could roll around, but they couldn't get up. And during that 60 days, 16 of those participants were centrifuged in a short arm human centrifuge. It's about 3 meters in radius. And that centrifuge generated artificial gravity at the equivalent of 1 G from the head to toe. So we were looking at what artificial gravity in a 30-minute bout per day could do for the participants who had been exposed to the equivalent of microgravity on the body. Mm-hmm. My particular field of research was how it would affect the hip muscles. So the way that I analyzed that data was that an MRI, or a magnetic resonance imaging scan, was taken of the hip. So it's that black and white image that you might have seen on TV shows, or you might have had one yourself even. And it's a cross section of the hip, and it can be built up to a 3D image of the hip. That was taken before the 60 days and then after the 60 days, so that we could compare whether the hip had changed first during bed rest, and also whether artificial gravity had changed any of those parameters.
Okay, so that's very interesting. So again, like first of all, can we talk about this kind of effect? So are we talking about, because doing this type of research and analysis? So that means we're talking about having again, before we started recording, kind of off camera, we said does it have this long term effect on the human body right now? So can you talk about multiple ways that we're trying to kind of mitigate the risk when it comes to having this long term health effects on living in those kind of zero G's environment?
Yeah, are we talking about the muscles or the body in general?
Just the body in general. I mean, what is there any ways
Mm.
besides the muscles? Is there, because I had some people on a podcast and we talked about there's a little bit of a pressure that will be increased in the skull because of that zero G's. So is there any other effects besides the muscle and the bone density that will have this kind of effect on a human body also? I know maybe it's
Yeah,
out of
there
your
are
current personal
countless.
reach, but
Yeah, no, it's I love talking about all fields of space medicine, and there are countless effects that microgravity has on the human body. We are designed to live in 1G. We're designed to live and evolve and reproduce on Earth, and all of our DNA in every cell of our body has been designed that way. We've never known any difference, and that's for any organism on Earth, and humans are not any exception. So when humans go into a field of microgravity, which could be in low Earth orbit, for example, or on a journey from Earth to the Moon or Mars, then all of those systems get disrupted. So aside from the muscle and the bone loss that happens, you think about the fluid shifts. Now, you can have you normally have fluid shifts, fluids throughout your body, but in microgravity, the body's not used to that lack of gravity. So the fluids, in terms of blood and other fluids in the body, will shift towards the head and the chest. So you think, what's the problem with that? Well, when people first get into space, then they feel this sort of congestion in their nose and their ears, and it can cause a lot of discomfort and even nausea. And if it's really bad, then that can compromise the mission even. So astronauts need to train hard for it, and that's why so many test pilots and sort of daredevils they are able to become astronauts, because they've already experienced this crazy manipulation of the gravity environment. So you get this fluid shift up, and the other thing that happens is that this gets a bit technical, but the receptors or the detectors for blood pressure in our body happen to be in the carotid arteries in the neck. If there's more blood up there in that area, then we think, well, the body thinks, oh, we've got high blood pressure, this is bad. So it undergoes all these mechanisms to try and get rid of your fluid. So you actually urinate more in space. And once you urinate more in space, you've got fluid loss. And when you have fluid loss, then you don't get enough, say, blood circulation to your vital organs or to your brain. So then it goes in a cycle of, false fluid loss due to a false sign of high blood pressure. And that's just one example of what can happen. The other thing with the fluid shift up is that it impresses, or it compresses the optic nerve and the back of the eyeball. So many astronauts come back with what's called space-acquired neuroocular syndrome, or SANS. It's a mysterious sort of condition where we don't fully understand it, but they seem to have their eyeballs a little bit compressed and their visual acuity impaired. So that's another huge thing we need to address, because how do we prevent them from losing their vision? That's really crucial for missions, and we can't manufacture glasses in space very easily. So we have to do something to prevent that. Other things to do with microgravity is that we think about infectious diseases. So COVID-19 in 2020, it's like on steroids in space, because not only does our body change, but the organisms around us change. Even when astronauts quarantine before going into space, they will bring inevitably some pathogens up there, some bacteria and viruses and fungi. And we have bacteria in our gut too, so we're
Mhm.
surrounded by microbes. We couldn't live without them.
Yeah.
The bad ones actually get mutant in space. They did some experiments on the ISS where they took salmonella up there. Salmonella is kind of where you find in your poorly cooked chicken and whatever. Makes the news every time somebody gets infected by it. And it develops this outer shell around the bacterial body. So it it shows signs of adapting to microgravity. So how humans, every organism adapts over time due to evolution and such. Because these bacteria have such a high turnover rate, they reproduce really rapidly. So they can detect when there's microgravity and adapt straight away. That means they're evil and they're nice and adapted, but we're not. So we're more vulnerable to these space mutant bacteria. That's
Well,
another thing we have to worry about. So
yeah,
yeah, plenty of things. I could go on.
maybe we just a little bit more complex than a bacteria. We made of many of those, again, different parts and particles. But it's like, so again, how we can tackle these problems, because we're talking about more than, again, bone density and muscle, decreasing in muscles, which of course astronauts do train, and I think they spend like an hour a day, or people that had they do analog missions, they spend an hour and two a day training, and kind of to make sure that they keep that density going. But like, what will be a way to solve these problems? I mean, long term, because is it how much of that it has to be done, again, if you're looking to colonize and go to the different planets and create those bases through just natural evolution? Should we just say, okay, there will be a point, there is a percentage that we just have to adapt, there is no other way that we can solve that type of problem? And what will be the percentage that we can actually solve through, as you mentioned, artificial gravity?
I can't give you a percentage. I wish I could, but the artificial gravity problem is still a proof of concept problem. We're still trying to prove the fact that it even works. That's what the AgBreezer study was to do. With the purpose of the AgBreezer study, it was to see whether artificial gravity could protect the hips in a 30-minute bout of 1G. Now, the result of that study was that it couldn't. There was no difference between the MRIs of the participants who lay in bed the whole time and the MRIs of those who were in the centrifuge for each day. So that raises a question as to what could protect the hips. And what about the other muscles as well? There's other people on the research team doing the other muscles, but when we talk about the hips, what can we do? Artificial gravity by itself, I don't think is the answer. It helps for things like the cardiovascular system and the neurovestibular system, which helps keeps our balance. But in terms of muscles, we need more than just 30 minutes of 1G a day. We need resistive exercise like squats and standing, running, those sorts of active things that will activate the nerve cells in the muscles and keep them from atrophying too much or getting too small. So yeah, my guess is that we'll need a combination of perhaps a centrifuge during downtime and active exercise, but there's not much more than that's been researched. Space medicine is such a big field that my study was the first to even look at the hips
Wow.
and artificial gravity. Yeah.
That is insane. And we're talking about, again, I don't know why. Like, okay, so that's a different topic. We can go into details why it's not being explored, because I mean it's super important. But okay, so if we're talking about muscle and bone density, what about, again, you mentioned that the fluids tend to go up in microgravity. So how we can tackle these problems? Because let's say if the astronauts, and scientists going to live in those environments for quite a while, and I don't know the way those missions going to look like, if they're going to come back at certain point after half a year or a year, or they're going to stay there long term, because if you want to, live in Mars kind of full time, and it seems like this is our kind of plan and path that we follow. So, what other ways that we can create, let's say, those, environments, instead of, because look, this is one of the problems that you cannot solve. Like
Mm.
with just staying in this kind of 1G environment for 1 hour a day, as I mentioned, because like if there is less gravity, the fluids will stay up like all the time, right? So,
Mhm.
like, so what way we can, is there anything happening right now that we can see that Because like, what's the longest period of time that somebody been in space and we actually do a research on those people, like on the effects of the like fluid staying up and the pressure, just like what is the longest
Mm.
period that we've been? 400 days?
Are we talking about the longest period that someone can possibly stay in space ever?
Yeah, that we've been so far as people.
So far, I don't I don't know. I should know my space history a bit more than this. But the longest that somebody has spent in space is, I think, just over a year. And I think it was a Russian astronaut, a Russian cosmonaut, sorry.
Yeah,
But not many people go up to that sort of level. Um, there are many astronauts who have spent a total of more than a year in space, but 1 year completely, it's only a few people, and
yeah,
it's really hard to take data from that sample because it's so small.
yeah,
We can't make any reliable conclusions. Plus, they are very healthy and fit people,
yeah.
and we're not sure whether we're able to apply that to all people or to all astronauts in the future. Um,
Exactly. So
a
how
mission
can
to Mars.
so sorry,
Sorry.
sorry, I wanted to ask you how we can exactly, because that's my point, like how we can spot these blind spots that we're not seeing currently at the moment, because we don't have anybody who has been in space for a year or two. But if we're expecting those missions on the Mars, because we're talking about 7 month trip, it's not easily done. We cannot take people, for 6 months and come back easily, because that's how long it will take us for us to put them on the planet in the first place. So that means they're going to spend a year or two. So we don't have any kind of tests done on that type of scale. So how we can predict again the effects on a human body if we're going to keep those people that long?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, that's a really, really great question because it allows me to pedal back to a concept which I call analog studies.
Hmm.
And analog studies are when we want to simulate the real thing, but the real thing is expensive. So we do like a simulation, which is a little bit more manageable, a little bit more controlled. And that's what the bed rest study was all about. A bed rest is a type of analog study. It's an analog for microgravity. You can have other analogs like Antarctica habitats for isolation analogs, or those sorts of things. You can make analogs for bacteria. You can put bacteria in a small centrifuge, like say this big, and spin them and see what happens to them, and that's an analog for them as well. So um, space medicine research is not just about putting actual humans in actual space. It's also about finding innovative and novel ways, sometimes very, very creative, to um, to simulate certain conditions of space on the human body in a sort of almost a laboratory environment where you can observe things, you can measure things, you can have lots of people do it at once, and it's expensive, but it's far cheaper than sending someone up on a rocket. Um, so your question about how we can predict these things, we essentially can either use analogs or we can use people going into space. So I would imagine in the near future that a lot of analog studies are going to be conducted. In fact, many studies have been approved in the next coming years to go ahead and to simulate more effects on the human body. But that's all we can do. And that's why it's so slow, and perhaps one of the rate limiting steps that have prevented us from going to the moon again or to Mars for the first time. We just don't know what's going to happen to these humans, and we need to do a lot more research.
Exactly, exactly. So, and what about again having these people on? If we're talking about bringing multiple people on the planet, and again you bring up a point that for now the threshold to become an astronaut is really high, and we're talking about a lot of it is focused on health and physical health, mental health aspects. So, and it's a very high kind of threshold that a lot of people cannot get to that level, because you have to be kind of super, this kind of superhuman, which a lot of us have unhealthy habits of eating or smoking or drinking. So how we can actually prepare for those moments where there will be let's say a moon base or Mars base, and we actually can sit down and look up on Google or somewhere on internet, and oh, I want to fly to Mars, but maybe I'm not physically fit, and to make that kind of transition and to stay there for a couple of months. So like, how would you advise people, and let's say a future kind of generation who would like to make that shift and live in those maybe different planets like full time? Like, how would you say to the people when it comes to handling your personal health and habits, that we can stay in the best shape ever?
That's a good question. I'm not a doctor yet, so don't take my advice to heart. But I would say, um, it's the standard sort of advice, like eat healthy, don't smoke. Now, interesting, smoking, that you bring that up, because smoking causes damage to DNA, whether you like it or not. And there have been statistics or predictions made where they predict the amount of radiation that one astronaut is allowed to have before they are not allowed to fly anymore. And there is a different category for smokers. So it's like you can have this much radiation for non-smokers, but if you're a smoker, you're allowed to have this much radiation. So it's a tangible difference. So I would try, in terms of the radiation, if people want to go to Moon or Mars, they have to consider the radiation damage that's going to do to their cells. And that's minimizing DNA damage, minimizing cancer risk, thinking about whether it's going to affect your fertility. That's another thing that's a big mystery. Does radiation of the space sort affect your fertility? So things like not smoking, eating healthy, avoiding pollutants and chemicals in your life where you can. There's a lot of evidence that people who live near coal-fired power plants, for example, will breathe in this terrible atmosphere, this air, which is polluted, and that can then cause DNA damage. Radiation workers have to be careful, occupational things like that. Keeping fit is a big one, because people who have good cardiovascular and resistive training will be able to adapt to the different things in space. Because if there's an emergency, for example, you want to be sure that you can exert yourself for a certain period just to keep your heart moving and keep your brain sort of in check. And that, again, that's why pilots were really favored back in the Apollo era, because they were used to having like no blood to their brain for a little while. Not no blood, but just a little bit of blood. Yeah, so I feel that I can tell you this, is that instead of having inclusion criteria like they did back in the day, they are starting to move towards a system of exclusion criteria. So instead of saying you must have these things, otherwise you're out, then they're sort of shifting more towards you can be whoever you want as long as you don't have these things. So it opens the pool up a little bit more. Do you know what I mean? Instead of prescribing what a person must be like, it's this is what you must not be like. And so maybe it's a bit easier for people to then modify their lifestyles to leave out those things.
Yeah.
And of course, mental health is a huge thing. I almost think it's as important as physical health. Not just about your personal health and being resilient, but also your behavioral skills and your teamwork skills. It depends on if you want to be a tourist or a crew member. Tourism, you may not need to have the same teamwork skills, but astronauts are selected very heavily based on how well they work in a team, how well they can lead, deal with conflict, communicate, all these sorts of things, which are critical to the mission as well.
Exactly. So you brought up a great point. So if you don't mind, I would like to expand on that point, because health is a part that we can handle, I think, easier. And once we cross the threshold in our heads that, okay, I need to handle my personal health and I need to take care of it because it's important. So once you kind of find your why, or the reasons why you need to do stuff and why you must to do those things, it's pretty easy from there. It's just like keeping the habit, which of course, like statistically 31 days or whatever, pick a number, but again, talking about those psychological issues, if we're talking about, again, putting people on space, and I brought it up, the subject, but I would love to get your personal kind of take on that. If we're talking about putting, let's say, first 20 people or 50 people or 100 or 1,000 people on Moon or on Mars, we're talking about people who are born and raised in different environments from different countries. They have different families, a lot of probably different psychological kind of issues in the family or in the environment. And those sometimes they get brought up in certain situations where there's pressure, around, and there's some certain, because it's going to be completely different. Now we're talking about in a place and people are very kind of frustrated and confused and angry, and we have those all the emotions and everything is boiling inside of people because of the COVID. People locked in their houses, and it's a pretty big deal. So imagine right now locked in a dome. There is like different gravity. I don't know exactly. Maybe you can tell us. There is no air. You cannot walk for outside and get the fresh air, and people would love to do that. And there's more kind of this buildup that can happen with people, and those kind of critical situations can happen. So, what would you again talk about this kind of psychological issues? Where there's going to be hate, love, different things happening amongst those communities, like in those environments, like how we can tackle these future problems too.
Oh yeah, I mean, again, there's no right answer to this, and um, so far, astronauts from different cultures, they're from different countries like the US, Russia, Japan. They have worked together on the International Space Station before, and I'm sure there's been studies about how they work together. Um, but they are the best of the best, and they are the type of people who would work well across cultures. They will be able to overcome cultural differences or be willing to step back on their cultural differences if it meant better team dynamics. When we start, say, what you said, 20, 50, 100 people going into space, then of course there's going to be a lot more room for conflict. And so how do we address that? Aside from selection criteria, I mean, I've been to a few talks about habitat design and how maybe it's not just about putting people in a dome. You need to have infrastructure for privacy. I think everybody values their privacy. On the International Space Station, which I must say was developed over 20 years ago, they didn't even think about those psychological aspects. They just wanted to keep people safe in an enclosed space. And whatever conflicts people would have, they would have to deal with it because they would be the best astronauts in the world. But when you have lots of people, and as we start to learn more about human psychology and isolation psychology, we start to realize that privacy it's not just a human need, it's a human right. And that means we need to have the necessary infrastructure, perhaps individual rooms, individual spaces for people to just be by themselves and recharge for the day before going out into the common space again to socialize. Now, habitat is one thing, and other parts of life. Food is a very important part of an astronaut's daily life. On the International Space Station, some crews eat together. They make the time and the effort to eat together. Sometimes they have special days. I've seen a picture of a crew eating pizza, making and eating pizza on the International Space Station because it's a special day, and I think one of the astronauts was Italian, so it was a significant day for him. His name is Paolo Nespoli. He's a great astronaut and a science communicator. And so when we cater to different people, when you go, you don't want to have the same food every day, and you don't want to have a food that's foreign to you. So if we start bringing in people from different cultures, perhaps we need to cater to their cultural tastes, just so that they're not just physically nourished, but also psychologically nourished. Yeah, and that's another example of one way that people can stay healthy in space, is just catering to these different needs and catering to diversity as much as possible. I would imagine that people who go into space and live and are meant to live together should go through some sort of training or some sort of analog first before they go into space. Otherwise, it would just completely be a culture shock, and it could be really, really disastrous.
Exactly. So there is a lot of moving pieces. I mean, when it comes to going and exploring these, those planets, and again, Moon. We've been on Moon, multiple times, and now we're planning to again with the Artemis mission, and now kind of Moon Village and Moon creating habitats on the Moon. It's either in craters and lava tubes, and there's different projects, comes with that, and it's super exciting. But again, when it comes to colonizing Mars, is a lot of it is unknown, So we trying to figure this out, and again, a lot of it is psychological kind of part of it. I think. I don't know what your take, because I don't think we lack resources or technology, and of course we talk about that. But a lot of it is just again handling the health part, what type of effects it will have long term and just psychological stuff, and just making sure we are ready, kind of on the same page, and we're best possible selves. Because I think, so what do you think, again, not getting on a politics side, too much, but because you think it will be kind of free society, because like Elon Musk talked about to give this approach, and he said he would love to be kind of free society where everybody has their own kind of voting rights or whatever. It's more freer, less rules and regulations than on the planet. Or you think we should carry what's in here, kind of same rules and regulations and politics and kind of monetization aspect as well, currency? Or what do you think the society is going to be like on Mars?
We haven't even figured it out on Earth yet. There is no such thing as a stable society or a 100% happy society. Somebody always loses, and there is going to be conflict somewhere, I think. Now, perhaps there are some countries in the world which have less conflict than others, but that doesn't mean that we should model our Mars society based on those particular countries, because we don't know whether it will work. What will society look like on Mars? It's nice to dream of a free society. Elon is a very visionary sort of person, and I would love to hear more about how he intends to create that free society. But realistically, I don't know how it's going to work. Yes, like give people the human rights and basic freedoms. Yes, I agree with that. But when it comes down to it, what would governance look like? And when I am faced with questions like these, I always go back to the pre-civilization times when we had tribes and groups of humans living in caves and whatnot. Firstly, we call them tribes. That means they were in groups. Not all of humanity was connected. Even if you take a 1 kilometer square area, you will still have groups within that, because groups will gather together based on families and based on common needs and interests. And yeah, you still have these clusters. Not everybody is going to get along exactly the same way with everybody else. So I imagine that there will be some sort of communities in there. And of course, each group back in the day had an elder or a chief in Native American, or whatever term you want to call it. Somebody was a leader. And we're going to have leaders when we settle on Mars. We can't be anarchists, which I believe is what Elon seems to want, is that everybody is their own everybody governs themselves and doesn't have to listen to anybody else's rules. I'd imagine we'd need some sort of leadership to keep things in order, but it wouldn't go so far as a dictatorship. We know that doesn't work.
Yeah. Well, it could, like, again, if we're talking about the leader at some point, again, it could be ruled out as a president, as something over time. Because if we put one person on the podium, because that's exactly what we have right now on the planet, we can call it the leader, we can call it the president, but that's what we have. And we have on multiple levels, government, there's a mayor, there's, politicians, there is a president, there is this, there's that. So, but so it looks like, again, we probably going to carry, because again, personal, I don't see either how we can put somebody on, on the Mars and create a colony without any rules and regulations, and nobody's accountable for anything. And it's good to dream about that. And I don't know, again, if that would work. Again, for a lot of people, especially during these times, that's what probably they dream about a lot of the time, because they blame only the presidents, the politicians, and, that's what they do. So people probably will dream about that a lot. And again, Elon Musk is kind of being one of those leaders in that industry. So again, it's very interesting, but the way it's going to turn out, but who knows? But again, can you share some of the other aspects of, let's say, of the health, and maybe again, because I know there's plenty of information when it comes to that. So maybe you can bring up some topics, some information that you want to share again about health aspects of kind of microgravity, and maybe something else that's very important for people to hear.
There's more of a likelihood for people to develop kidney stones in space. And so this is why. The main mechanism is that we have bone loss, something that I haven't talked about yet, but you have mentioned it, bone loss, because the bones actually have the ability to sense whether somebody is weight bearing, whether the body is exercising or putting itself under a load. And of course, putting oneself load is healthy. It means that the person is functioning, and that tells the body to build more bone. Now, when the astronauts go into space, then there's microgravity, and so there's much less loading. There's still a little bit when people push off from the walls of the ISS, for example, not as much. So the bones feel unloaded, and when that happens, then the calcium in the bones will actually undergo resorption into the blood, back into the blood. So you can have calcium in your blood, calcium ions. They're either going to be in the blood or they're going to be in the bone. If they're not in the bone, then they're going to go into the blood. When we have lots of calcium ions going into the blood, then they can accumulate in the kidneys, which have very, very small arteries and veins, and that's where the kidney stones happen. And that can be considered a medical emergency in some circumstances on Earth, and I'd imagine it'd be the same for astronauts. And that leads me to think about how we're going to do surgery and deal with emergency situations in space. Nobody has ever needed to be evacuated from the International Space Station or on a mission, thankfully. But that's because, these missions have been relatively short and there have been enough precautions in place so that people are safe while they're up there. But I'd imagine that you give it infinity years, at some point there's going to be perhaps a need for surgery or an emergency evacuation. So we wonder what would happen then. There's a great National Geographic docudrama called Mars, and on there, one of the characters gives birth. How do we even deal with that? There are so many things that we are simply only able to speculate, but we don't even know how to begin to research that. With surgery in space, how do you keep fluids in the one place? As soon as blood is escaping the body somewhere, it's going to go into the atmosphere, right? It's not going to stay on the body like it does on Earth. So we need to find some way to keep, to maintain, control of those sort of situations. And something as simple as CPR, when people do the chest compressions, how do you think you do that in space? Normally on Earth you use gravity, but in space, one of the proposed mechanisms is that if this is the cross section of the space capsule, right? You'll strap the patient to the bottom or one side of the capsule, and you will put your legs on the other side of the space capsule and use that to push off from the wall of the spacecraft and perform the chest compressions that way. There is no other way that you can use force on the person's chest other than using your own legs to push off the opposite wall.
Yeah.
So many things that we have to look at. And the reason that they've been able to test that is due to parabolic flights, which is another type of analog where they get a plane and they, a special type of aircraft, and they put the aircraft in free fall just for 30 seconds. And during that time, they can test different things that happen in microgravity. So surgery in space, giving birth in space, and dealing with medical emergencies, huge, and something that really needs to be addressed before we can even, begin to think about sending people to Mars, especially normal civilians.
Exactly. So so we can think about probably multiple scenarios, and I'm probably sure there's, scientists and engineers that are thinking about, solving these problems. And as far as I imagine, so it could be carried to, again, as you mentioned, like one of those, I don't know exactly what you call them, that the pilots go through, and, NASA astronauts go through those, I don't know how do you call them when it kind of goes and it creates this kind of simulated G's, that people go through. So probably could be carried in one of those kind of, if you have an emergency, it could be carried, and it could be kind of spinned, and that will create some sort of a, let's say 1 or 2 or 3 G's will be enough to kind of keep the blood flowing. Let's say you make sure that the blood will not kind of explode out all over the place, or so it could be done but it's very kind of primitive. So would you think any of the kind of, if we go in the future and we're talking about creating, let's say, artificial gravity, and again what we're seeing kind of in those sci-fi movies where there's a spaceship flying and people walking around like on the ground, so do you think that happening, or that's kind of above, like that's beyond the physics, and you don't think it's even possible for people to grasp on that?
Funnily enough, one of the older of the sci-fi movies or the space movies, 2001: A Space Odyssey, so far, according to some people who've to just the people in my space medicine community who have analyzed this, that movie portrays artificial gravity most accurately. And if you remember in the movie, then the spacecraft that the two astronauts Frank and Dave are in, it looks like it's got a head and it's got a long body, and then it's got, you know, something at the tail, like a larger part of the tail. And I think that the centrifuge part, where that I show at the beginning of the scene, is at one of the larger ends of the spacecraft, either the head or the tail. I don't know if we'll ever create a spacecraft like that, but it takes an awful amount of effort and time and money and all that to create something that is big enough to hold a centrifuge. It's 3 meters in diameter. That's, and including the hub, that's going to be what, 7 meters in diameter, and that would just be for the centrifuge itself. The ISS hadn't done it yet because it was too expensive. I'm not sure whether we'll be able to do it. I think, I can't quite remember what the dimensions of Elon Musk's Starship are, but with bigger spacecrafts, it could certainly be possible if it is medically proven that it will work. Remember, the study that I was in, it was looking at a proof of concept. So we're not even sure what sort of amount of artificial gravity would be justifiable to prevent muscle and bone loss and the effects of microgravity. So first we need to prove that it works, and then we can think about the engineering.
Exactly. So yeah, so a lot of the things we still have to work on, and it's 2020, and again, with what's happening right now in the economy with this, you know, pandemics and stuff like that, things are just getting, you know, slower right now. Again, we already got the situation going pretty slow, but now things are going even slower. But hopefully we can see some people again back on the moon in 2024, and you know, because that's something very exciting to look forward to. Because I'm sure you haven't seen the moon landing before, neither I. And again, that's because I see you have that in the background, and it's really cool as you see here. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
awesome. It's one of those things that people are looking forward to. Again, our generation, younger generation, I think it will inspire a lot of people. And through those younger people, again, what's happening right now, there's a big shift. There's a lot of private companies are starting up in the space industry. So now it's a really good time, you know. So I think there is a lot of kind of, you know, future does look bright, but again, we just have to go through all these clouds and all these noise and what's happening right now. But is there any particular kind of space projects that you kind of want to point out and bring attention to the people that maybe a lot of people don't know about also?
Well, Breeze is my favorite one because I worked on it. Other projects that I can think of. Well, you mentioning more private companies are getting involved, and there's a group that Robert Zubrin started called the Mars Society, and I'm quite sure that it started in the US, but there are Mars societies all around the world, and we have one in Australia. It's called MSA, or Mars Society Australia, and for many years now, MSA has been working on building its own Mars or MSA analog habitat in the desert in South Australia. Now, it can be modeled off the MDRS, the Mars Desert Research Station in Utah, in the States. And they put that there in Utah because it's an ideal environment to simulate the Mars habitat, or the Mars environment. It's a desert. It's quite stable of a climate. There's nothing for miles and miles and miles. And the geology of the place is, if you look at photos of it, it's reddish, it's dusty. So people can do all sorts of different analogs there, and it's the same in Australia. Many people who think of Australia think it's just a red desert out here. I promise, I'm in Australia. I'm in a house, so it's not just a red desert. But there are parts of Australia which it's just a wide open expanse, and the land can be used for analogs too, just like in Utah. And so if people want to look at what Mars Society Australia is doing, they can probably put that in a Google search and see what the latest is on that. It's not fully constructed yet, but how wonderful would it be to have an analog right here in Australia and not have to go to places like Antarctica or the USA to be able to undergo a research analog study?
Beautiful, beautiful. So hopefully, again, Mars Society is going to work on these projects, and I do always encourage a lot of people because, again, I know there's a lot of people who watch these episodes. Maybe they work on, architecture, and maybe they're, in law. And again, for the people who are watching, if you're a bit, professional in any industry, that could be very relatable to what's going to be happening again with creating those. Colonization, when we talk about those aspects, those people will be needed and now needed, because there's again creating a space law, and again medicine and architecture. So I do encourage heavily a lot again who's watching to be part of those again missions or create them some sort of emissions, bring people together because it's all about that, resourcefulness. So, what do you think about again? Because I'm sure you get that question asked from time to time, as a lot of people again who are in astrophotography or just working in space projects get asked from time to time. So, do you believe there's some sort of a green man, out there, extraterrestrial human being likes, or again, I'm not talking about kind of microbiological, microbial level. Let's say a little bit more advanced.
I would say that I was actually listening to an interesting radio segment on ABC the other day about this, and they were talking about the Drake equation, which people in astrobiology would know. It's an equation where multiple factors are multiplied together to determine the probability that there is intelligent life in the universe within a certain distance. And that when people put numbers into that equation, it can range from less than 0.1% to many orders of magnitude higher than that. So the actual margin of error for an equation like that is huge. I like to believe that, well, it's not zero, so it surely it means that there's intelligent life out there. Now, you asked me, do I think there is? I have no evidence to show that there is exactly, but with the size of the universe and the time that it's been around, I think that there is life out there. It would be scary to think that we would be alone in the universe. I think there is life out there. The question is, what do we do to look for that life? How similar must it be to us to be life? And where along the spectrum of bacteria to multicellular organisms do we sit? Where do we want to find these beings? So yes, I think they're out there. We might just not be able to find them with the technology that we have. In 2001: A Space Odyssey, the humans are looking for. This is a spoiler, so skip ahead of like 3 minutes if you don't want to hear the spoiler. But the premise is that the humans are looking for beings like them, and they go to Jupiter and everything to find beings like them, not realizing that something like a big black rectangle could be a sign of beings that are not quite like them. And so we need to expand the definition of what it means to be intelligent life. Do we need to have carbon in our DNA to have that? Do we need to have reproduced? It's you can go all sorts of ways with that, and certainly I'm not an expert in it. So, but I do think they're out there.
Exactly, but it's a very interesting discussion because it's been in the movies, like you mentioned, Space Odyssey. It's been in that movie, and it's been in multiple movies. There's multiple documentaries, and a lot of that is just kind of based on theory because we still don't have an answers when it comes to that. But again, you brought up a great perspective because who knows, because most of the time when we picture, let's say, this kind of alien, the typical alien is going to be kind of palish, green and big eyes, small mouth, so big head. Again, different what we have here on the planet. So, and it doesn't look like, maybe it looks like a little bit because it has, the limbs, the legs, but you know, like it could be completely different. Like the somebody that I came across on a few podcasts, you know, having about this kind of psychedelic trips and people having that type of experience. Like I will be talking about that. This interview is supposed to happen today because of the pandemic. Hopefully that person is not sick, but she said she's not feeling well, so hopefully she's well by now. And she was a video game developer, so she was kind of coming from IT background. So she she went to South America. She had this kind of psychedelic experience, and she came back and she started painting this, like the most amazing, like, you know, pictures, like paintings of universe and nebula and things like that. So, you know, so, and a lot of that people talk about is, you know, when they have those trips, is it feels like they accessing some sort of a, you know, because now people, we talking about having a multiverse, and again there is a string theory, so we have a lot of different theories. Again, no proven facts yet, but it could be that, you know, theoretically, because we, if we're going to take a look at our brain and the way that, again, neurons, or, you know, the way the brain looks on kind of, you know, microscopical level, it's very similar to what the universe looks like, you know. So it could be a chance, or maybe there is a chance that we're actually accessing through those again psychedelic experiences, that we're accessing the universe, you know. It
Mhm.
could be that, because we as people, we think it should be more advanced. You know, how do we know that it's more advanced, and how do we know that you know, math and science is universal language? Maybe we're going actually the opposite direction of what the life is really is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm open to all sorts of speculation, no matter how crazy and new agey it sounds. I just go back to stories from the past, like how we had Newtonian physics, or we had, say, Niels Bohr model of the atom. He thought that the atom was a flat plane that with concentric circles of electrons around a nucleus. It wasn't the case, because Schrodinger smashed that theory apart, and he found that we have clouds of electrons in a sphere around the central nucleus. And what's that to say there's going to be another scientist or a group of scientists down the track to smash that theory again? We just keep having to change our idea of what is real. Now, what we learn in school, of course, when I teach primary and high school students, I have to show them the Niels Bohr model first to help them understand at the most basic level what it is. But that's only one model of reality. There's many different models of reality, getting more and more advanced and constantly changing too. So yeah, who knows what definition of aliens there will be in the future, and how we'll define science in the future.
Exactly, exactly. It's for the future to decide, and for us to decide if we want to kind of follow through. Because again, people are doing different researches now. We, like, I spoke with some people who are, you know, creating synthetic cells, and they're looking to make those groundbreaking, like, research moments. And we're talking about 100 different organizations, and she's part of one of the organizations. There's like 18 people working in that specific organization. It's kind of half of that government's funded, but they could not do it yet, because we're talking about kind of, you know, creating a god's work, because we have not been able to create life yet, you know, like from scratch, you know, from a biological level, you know, putting cells together, and again using that kind of you know, from artificial level. So again, and we're working on that. At the same time, we're working on explore Mars and Moon, and, you know, creating different stuff. Again, how do we handle our human bodies again in those environments? So there's a lot of different aspects when it comes to that. But yours is very important, because, like, look, we're talking about the Artemis mission, colonizing Mars, and how we're going to be handling those kind of health aspects, and, you know, can we even colonize Mars? So talking about those projections, like personally, like without giving again specific number, because I'm sure nobody has an answer for that, but like how long do you see us and people living on Mars from now?
I would give it, this is very like out there, but I'd give it 100 years before we can call Mars a place to call home for
Mm.
some people. It's going to take, it took man landed on the moon in 1969. It's now been over 50 years since that time, and we haven't gone any further. And I understand that there's many barriers to that, but give it another 50 years, we might have just set foot on Mars and, built some things, put some robots on there to help build the infrastructure before more people get there. Um, Give it another 50 years to be able to safely send large numbers of people to a planet with enough infrastructure to survive all the different environmental factors like radiation, dust storms, microgravity, all those sorts of things. I give it 100 years before we can see people safely calling Mars a civilization and perhaps even producing children on Mars. That's another huge thing we need to look at.
Exactly. Yeah. So more research, more research. We need to do that.
So much more.
Exactly. So if you don't mind me asking again about the STEM education, maybe you can explain to the people, first of all, what is STEM, and like, because you're part of that and you provide, an education, so you teach people about that. So can you talk about what are you currently working on with that?
Yeah, STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and maths. And that's the standard acronym that people use to describe what some people call the hard sciences, or the physical sciences, things that involve numbers and calculations and applying equations to real life situations. I have always been interested in STEM subjects, and when I finished high school and started university, I did some tutoring on the side. So I would, I'd help students achieve better grades in those subjects and help them understand things from a different point of view, perhaps giving them a different perspective from what school gave them. And I find it personally very rewarding because I get to share my passion and I get to talk about science and maths to people and hopefully inspire them, not just to get better grades, but to pursue those sorts of jobs. And even if they don't pursue that job, to keep in mind that it's always useful to be fascinated by the universe. We live in such a wonderful world, and if you don't have that science lens and you sort of kind of blinded to it, then you're missing out on so much. So I don't want my students to miss out on the wonders of the earth and the universe. And so I try to not only instill how to use an equation and A plus B equals C, but also keep an open mind and keep that fascination alive. Don't let it go away after you turn 18 or whatever. I also like to do a bit of volunteering at places like Hamilton Secondary College Space School, where they have basically a Mars simulation surface in the school, and different kids from other schools can come and pretend to be Mars astronauts collecting rocks from the surface and analyzing them. So it's a really wonderful place, and it was modeled off VSEC. That's Victorian Space Science Education Centre. So you can put that in the description if you like. It's a really excellent place for kids to get inspired and feel like what it's like to be an astronaut themselves. So I really enjoy STEM education, extremely important. And psychologically, I hear that there's this theory that says if you don't inspire a kid to pursue STEM by the age of year 7, so 12 years old, then it's going to be extremely difficult to do so after that. It needs to start really young. Even though you think kids won't understand the concepts, they will in some way. If there's someone there to explain it and communicate it to kids, they will pick it up.
So what would you say again to the people, and it doesn't matter again, younger people, because I'm sure there's people watching who are maybe 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. Like, so what would you say to those people in general? Why people should get involved with these, again, with different projects, space-related projects, and, why space should be such an important piece for our kind of personal lives also?
It's our world. Why wouldn't you be so fascinated by what's around you? And when I say around you, I'm not talking about your family, your friends, your dog, the cafe down the street. I'm talking about how this world was made and how the world within that world was made. And then when you get bigger and bigger, you think about how was the universe made? How did we even get here? Sometimes it scares people, but sometimes it fascinates other people. And I think it's such a waste of a world if you go through life and not wonder about these things. And of course, life is busy. People, there are stresses in life, but sometimes it is so calming and soothing to look up into the sky and think about these sorts of things. I went outside just before this interview and looked at the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, which was really cool. So those sort of special moments happen. And yeah, the more we understand about it, the more we don't understand. And yeah, if you get some questions answered, that's not the end. You realize that there's more and more out there the further and further you go. So you never stop learning. That you never stop learning.
Exactly, because like there's different things, and it's like you can get confused very easily right now because again, coming from a business background, there's a lot of great business books like a lot of people talk about. Again, this is kind of not the business podcast to talk about, but Rich Dad Poor Dad, a great book that a lot of people, millions of people read about. They kind of change their own personal perspective of on business life in general, because he talks about 95% of the people kind of working or are self-employed. The other side of people, 5% are business owners, investors, and so we're talking about completely different thought process and the way people think. So if you're talking about, because again, 95% of the people, and that's kind of statistics that we have, and I'm seeing through the window a lot of people going with the cars, and I'm actually thinking about how many of those people are actually thinking about the space right now, you know? So
Yeah.
it has to be kind of one of the topics that, I mean, people should create these podcasts all the time because if you would see more people again coming on these podcasts and sharing their own personal journeys, and there will be more people watching these episodes, it will be great benefit for everybody. It's not for my own benefit because I'm spending the time, and V spending her personal time. She can do anything else beside this, but she want to bring more
Oh, this is my
attention.
favorite thing to do. Sorry for interrupting.
No, go ahead. So I know you love it because it's your personal passion. So for me
Mhm.
personally, I want to ignite those 95% of the people because I do understand they're busy with, again, with paying the bills and the rent. And like we think about stuff also, about the business and how we do better and things like that. But your mind should be occupied with space at least some of the time because it's good to have this perspective. Because when I
Mm.
used to be a kid, when I thought I had the problem, I used to always look up at the sky and wonder like what's out there, because when I'm having this kind of small problem, whatever that is, it's kind of that big. I'm thinking, oh my God, this is the biggest problem in the world. Nobody else has this problem. But when you dream and think about, okay, there's vast of the universe and there's something happening out there, you think about like, what am I complaining about? You know? And that's what the life is, because we need that perspective, kind of universal perspective, because now we're thinking about a lot of the stuff on a daily basis that don't even matter, you know. So so
Mm.
so so we
Yeah,
need,
totally. You can take that perspective. Yeah.
yeah, because we need to think about that. Because first of all, as I said, it's going to be a little bit scary when we think about universe, and it expands. It expands like at an insane of rate of speed. I mean, it's faster than the speed of light, and we're talking about again planets, and maybe there's aliens, maybe there's something out there, and again, it's just a lot of things happening, and we are this pale blue dot, as one really great guy said. So we're kind of not a big deal when we think about that, but at the same time we still are, because we should go and pursue again different things and explore universe and things like that, because it's cool first of all.
It's
So
cool, and it makes sense. Every
exactly.
piece of technology that I see in this room that I'm sitting in probably has something to do with space. I
Yep.
think Wi-Fi originated in space, and many different spin-offs from space research are
Yep.
being used every day now.
Exactly. Phone camera, athletic shoes, I mean, phone mattress, like different stuff. So the question is, if we could explore more, I mean, what's the chance of us coming up with some sort of a new inventions that would benefit us
Mm,
as society? So there's a lot of great things that will come through this. But it's just
mm.
getting more people involved, because most of the time when people talking about, oh, there's not enough funding, because it's easy to say it's not enough funding. But okay, how we can solve that problem? Bring more people attention to the projects, because one of the
Mhm.
biggest problems that we have right now, and of course, I don't know what's your personal take again on SpaceX, and again launching satellites, and it's good. Like, we need the internet connection. It brings people like us together when we can have this conversation. But at the same time, it makes, like, the social media makes us impatient. Where we want everything instantly right now. So, and we talking about Artemis project in 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. Like, I don't have the patience for that. So we as people want everything fast. And Elon Musk
Can you?
is being one of those people.
Oh, absolutely. He is making strides for sure, but there are many other people also making strides in the space environment. Can you imagine? I was just going to say how Verna von Braun would have felt. Now, I can't remember how, how his life ended, but there are if you Google the right search terms, you can find his blueprint for how we get to Mars. His original dream was not to go to the moon; it was actually to go to Mars. He's got drawings from the 60s and 50s of how we could get there, what sort of rocket technology we could use, and the orbital mechanics behind going to Mars. Can you imagine if he was listening, or if he was present today, looking at the 50+ years that we've had to be able to go there? He would have been impatient too. I can tell you that. Space is not, space and research is not an instant thing. It takes years to publish a paper. It takes many years to be able to finish something. But I totally agree that if more people in public and in research and industry get on board with this sort of technology and these developments, then it will help. It will help. And of course, that then helps with the funding as well.
Yeah. So would you be for it or against it? Again, if we're talking about artificial, not artificial gravity, but artificial intelligence in general, and again, people coming back to Elon Musk point, and I'm sure there is probably more companies that I'm not aware of talking about kind of implementing, kind of making AI, compatible with human beings and whatever that looks like, kind of, making that symbiotic, relationship happening. And, so we can make, because life is made up of what? Is made up of the decisions. And my favorite quote is, the best math that we can learn is how to calculate the future cost of our current decisions. Is because that's what it is. Is like the decisions that we're making today, the decision that you came and talk on this podcast is because you made, again, and that will bring you up to the future projections. Of course, we cannot picture it, we cannot imagine where you're going to be, again, because of this podcast, other podcasts, and what you're doing personally in life. But the reason where you are right now, where you are, is because you made a lot of good decisions. So and that's what the life is. So what do you think personally we should, make that relationship again from AI perspective and human perspective, so we can make better quality decisions that will advance us into this kind of crazy futuristic, future, faster.
What I say about AI is probably the same thing that somebody else probably said about the internet, or about mobile phones, or about electricity, even, or about cars. When a new technology comes around, it scares some people and excites some people. It's always going to be that sort of dichotomy with people in between. And I say the same thing about AI. We, like the car, like electricity, like mobile phones and the internet, we can use them, and it will very much enhance our lives and the people around us. It may enhance the lives of people in developing countries who may not otherwise be able to survive without a business on the internet or the ability to call people. But we need to use it responsibly. Mm-hmm. Now, if I take mobile phones as an example, people at the start thought, wow, mobile phones, amazing. Like we can browse the internet right in our pocket, and we can make calls without having to use a landline phone connected to the wall. And people thought it was amazing. And on the other hand, I'm sure there were people who were worried and said, well, what if people are able to use these mobile phones to for surveillance purposes, for illicit purposes, nefarious purposes? I'm sure people were thinking of that as well. And look what's happened now. There are people using it for those sorts of purposes. I think that AI is going to inevitably bring the good and the bad, but we must try to use it responsibly as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the mistakes are unavoidable. It's in our personal lives. That's happening multiple times a day, at least in my life. Like I do make mistakes a lot, but again, it's part of life, part of the learning curve. And again, you try to surround yourself with the great people that would give you the best advice. And again, sometimes you think you take the best advice, but again, you just don't know. So a lot of it is unknown. And when it comes to AI, there is a lot of it unknown, and we can just debate, and it's a big kind of question, but it seems like we're going there. It seems like we're going to that direction, which is inevitable, which is going to be kind of this technological based life, and we are kind of halfway there, because we have this conversation virtually. We feel like we're there, we're having conversation, people listening through their phones, and we're kind of having this, symbiotic relationship already, but we don't feel like it, but it's already there. So we are in like we're getting to that place of having that relationship. Is just taking that kind of next step, which of course, like personally, probably I wouldn't do it myself, because like I don't know if I want to remember every single thing in my life, because that probably will give access to that, because there are certain things that in life that you probably want to forget, you know but it could be great for us as people. So again, as I mentioned, there's many different aspects in life, and especially in space science, that we still have to explore. So again, awesome. So again, for you guys, I would love to get in contact again with V, and that's going to be Twitter handle, as I mentioned. V Astronaut is going to be included in the show notes. So get in contact with her, ask her questions. Again, if you're looking to be part of some projects and you want to share some thoughts and ideas, again, make that connection and have a conversation, because she's pretty approachable. Like we had a discussion on Twitter as well. So she's awesome. She has a lot of great knowledge, information, as you see here, and I'm sure there's many more kind of uncovered information and many more layers that we can peel. And maybe you can come back on a podcast sometime in the future, and we can peel more layers and kind of understand more about space science and maybe different aspects, and because it's awesome. So again, guys and girls, one thing I want to ask you before we're going to go, if you share this episode with your friends, and as you know, it could be any friend, because the reason I just want to bring more attention, again, first of all, to V, the project that she's working on, that look, space industry is accessible to all. You should be part of these projects, and no matter on what level. So make sure to send this episode to your friends. And for you especially, I want to say big thank you again for coming over today and sharing your personal passion and reasons why you do what you do. And I love the fact that you're putting your own time and effort, researching and finding the answers, and which a lot of it is really tough. I mean, we're talking about really tough subjects, but you're making things happen, which is awesome. So really appreciate you for doing what you do.
Thank you so much, Martinez. There's really kind words, and yeah, to me, if I do something that I'm passionate about, it doesn't feel like hard work. It feels like fun with a little bit of grit. So, yeah, I'm always happy to talk about it. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast and talking to your listeners. I hope that all of you listening have learned something today.
Exactly, indeed, guys. So as I mentioned, make sure to share the episode with your friends. And as always, guys, I'll see you next time. And until then, don't forget to keep exploring.